The autumn wind howled through Green River Valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of the earliest blizzard Wyoming had seen in a decade. It was 1805, and the frontier settlements along the river knew better than to ignore nature's warnings. Smoke rose from cabin chimneys as families huddled close to their fires, preparing for the storm that darkened the western horizon like a bruise spreading across God's own canvas. Eliza Hartwell lived where the respectable folk rarely ventured, in a pitiful lean-to shelter near the river's edge, cobbled together from rotting timber and patched with canvas so threadbare it might as well have been cheesecloth. At 23 years old, she carried a body that told the story of survival in the cruelest way. Round and heavy, the paradoxical result of years eating whatever scraps she could find whenever she could find them, her body clinging desperately to every calorie against the specter of starvation. The fever had taken her parents 4 years ago, sweeping through the settlement like the angel of death. Eliza had nursed them both until their final breaths, then found herself suddenly alone in a world that had no patience for a young woman with no family, no husband, and a body that didn't fit the lean, work-hardened mold of frontier respectability. The lazy bear, that's what they called her in the settlement, not to her face, of course. The frontier had at least that thin veneer of civilization. But she heard the whispers, saw the way mothers pulled their children aside when she walked past, felt the weight of their judgment heavier than any physical burden she carried. "Takes up space meant for decent folk," Old Man Simons had declared last spring when she'd approached the barn dance, drawn by the fiddle music and the desperate human need for connection. The crowd had parted like the Red Sea, and the music had stuttered to an awkward halt. Eliza had turned and walked back into the darkness, each step away from the warm light another brick in the wall she was building around her heart. Today, as the storm clouds gathered with ominous speed, Eliza worked her small trapline along the riverbank. Her hands, chapped and raw despite the cloth wrappings, moved with practiced efficiency as she checked each snare. 2 rabbits, that would be stew for 3 days if she was careful. She added them to the canvas sack slung across her shoulder, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back from the weight. The first snowflakes began to fall as she gathered deadwood for her fire. They were the large, heavy kind that meant business, not the delicate crystals of a gentle snow. Eliza quickened her pace, her breath coming in white puffs. She knew these mountains, knew how quickly a person could die out here when the weather turned. That's when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, a high, thin sound that could have been a bird or a branch scraping against rock. But then it came again, more clearly this time, the unmistakable whimper of a child in distress. Eliza dropped her bundle of wood and plunged into the thickening curtain of snow, following the sound. Her legs burned as she pushed through knee-deep drifts that were forming with terrifying speed. "Hello!" she called out, her voice nearly swallowed by the howling wind. "Where are you?" The crying grew louder, more desperate. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she searched, squinting against the stinging snow. There, a flash of dark fabric against white. She lurched forward and fell to her knees, digging frantically with her bare hands into a snowdrift that had accumulated against a fallen log. Her fingers found fabric, then a small, icy hand. She dug harder, ignoring the pain as her nails tore against frozen earth and hidden roots. Within moments, she'd uncovered a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, curled into a tight ball. His lips were blue, his face pale as death, and his eyes fluttered with that dangerous drowsiness that meant hypothermia was setting its deadly grip. "No, no, no," Eliza muttered, pulling the child free. "Stay awake, honey. Stay with me." She recognized him immediately. Thomas, son of Jedediah Crane, the legendary mountain man whose name was spoken with equal parts respect and fear throughout the territory. Jed was out on one of his extended hunting trips. The boy must have wandered from whoever was meant to be watching him. Thomas's eyes focused on her briefly, filled with terror and cold and confusion. "Mama," he whispered, though everyone knew his mother had died birthing him 5 winters ago. Eliza didn't hesitate. She tore off the only warm coat she owned, a bear fur her father had trapped years ago, now patched and worn but still serviceable, and wrapped it around the shivering child. The cold bit into her own body immediately, cutting through her thin dress like knives. She pulled Thomas against her chest and began running. From the settlement, barely visible through the white curtain of snow, she could see lights in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. People were home, safe and warm. She opened her mouth to scream for help, but the wind tore the sound away. She saw figures moving behind lit windows, shadows of families gathering together against the storm. And then she saw them more clearly, a group of settlers standing on the porch of the general store, watching her struggle through the snow with the boy, watching and doing nothing. "Help!" she screamed again, waving one arm frantically while the other cradled Thomas. "Please!" One of the women, Margaret Holloway, wife of the settlement's self-appointed mayor, said something to the others. Even from this distance, even through the storm, Eliza could see them laugh. She watched as they turned their backs and went inside, pulling the door firmly shut against the cold, against her. The rejection hit harder than the wind. For a moment, Eliza stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the stunning cruelty of it. Then Thomas whimpered against her chest, and training born of years watching her mother nurse the sick kicked in. She turned toward her lean-to, 2 miles away through what was rapidly becoming a full blizzard, and began to run. The journey became a nightmare of white and cold and burning lungs. The wind slashed at Eliza's exposed skin, and she could feel ice forming in her hair, weighing down her sodden dress. Thomas had stopped shivering, a bad sign, and lay limp in her arms. She kept her body bent over him, using her size as a shield against the elements, absorbing the worst of the storm with her own flesh. "You're going to live," she gasped, more to herself than to the unconscious child. "I won't let you die, not you, not on my watch." Her legs gave out twice, and twice she forced herself back up, staggering forward through snow that was now thigh-deep in the drifts. She could no longer feel her feet, could barely feel her hands clutching Thomas. Her whole world had narrowed to a single purpose: get this child to shelter. When her lean-to finally materialized through the white curtain, Eliza nearly sobbed with relief. She kicked open the flap. There was no door, just canvas, and stumbled inside. The space was barely 8 feet square, with a fire pit in the center and a single bedroll against one wall. But it was shelter, and that was everything. With trembling hands, she laid Thomas on her bedroll and began stripping off his wet clothes. His skin was like ice, his breathing shallow and rapid. Eliza's own clothes were soaked through, but she didn't dare change. She needed every second to work on the boy. She coaxed a fire to life with her last dry kindling, blowing on it until flames licked upward. The wet wood she'd gathered earlier was useless now, so she began breaking apart one of the walls of her shelter, feeding the boards into the fire. She'd freeze later, but the boy needed heat now. As the shelter warmed, relatively speaking, Eliza stripped down to her threadbare shift and lay down beside Thomas, pulling him against her body and wrapping them both in her thin blanket and the bare fur coat. She knew the science of it, even if she didn't know the fancy words: body heat transfers, skin to skin, core warmth to extremities. The boy's icy skin burned against her own, and she gritted her teeth against the painful pins and needles sensation. She rubbed his back, his arms, his legs, forcing circulation to return. She breathed warm air onto his face, his neck, his hands. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, shaking the remains of her shelter. The fire burned low, and Eliza had to keep feeding it pieces of her home. Thomas's breathing gradually steadied, his color slowly returning from deathly gray to something approaching normal. Around midnight, his eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" he whispered again, confused. "Shh, honey," Eliza murmured, smoothing his dark hair. "You're safe now. You're going to be just fine." "Cold," he whimpered. "I know, sweetheart. I know." She held him closer, giving him what warmth her body could provide. "Who are you?" His voice was small, frightened. "My name's Eliza. I found you in the snow. Your papa will be back soon, I'm sure of it." "The nice bear lady," Thomas mumbled, his eyes already closing again as exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. "Papa says bears are warm." Despite everything, the cold, the pain, the exhaustion, Eliza smiled. "That's right, honey. Warm and safe. Now sleep." She stayed awake the entire night, keeping the fire alive, monitoring Thomas's breathing, rubbing warmth into his small limbs. Only when the storm began to break at dawn, when the howling wind finally quieted to a moan and then to silence, did she allow herself to close her eyes. Eliza woke to shouting. For a confused moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her entire body screamed with pain. Then she felt the small, warm weight against her chest and remembered Thomas, the storm, the long night. The shouting grew louder, and she recognized the voices of the settlement folk. Her heart sank. They'd found them. The canvas flap was torn aside, flooding the shelter with painfully bright sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. Eliza blinked, disoriented, as figures crowded into the small space. "There!" Margaret Holloway's shrill voice cut through the confusion. "I told you, the fat girl has him!" Rough hands grabbed at Eliza, pulling her away from Thomas. She cried out in protest as they wrenched the boy from her arms. Thomas, still half asleep, began to cry. "No, wait!" Eliza tried to speak, but someone shoved her backward. She stumbled, her legs weak from the ordeal of the previous night, and fell against the remnants of her wall. "Kidnapper!" someone shouted. "Probably wanted to ransom him back to Jedediah for food, the greedy thing. Look at her. Of course she's always thinking about her next meal." The accusations flew like arrows, each one finding its mark. Eliza looked around desperately for a friendly face, for someone who would listen. But the crowd that had gathered in and around her shelter wore only expressions of disgust and anger. "Please," she gasped, struggling to her feet. "Please, I saved him. He was dying in the snow. Liar!" Old Man Simons pushed his way forward, his face red with righteous fury. "We all know your type. Probably lured the boy out there yourself, then pretended to rescue him." "That's not... I would never... She's still wearing his father's coat." Margaret pointed at the bear fur that had fallen from the bedroll. "Probably stole it when she took the boy." "That's mine. My father..." But her voice was drowned out by the angry crowd. Thomas was passed to Margaret, who made a great show of clutching him protectively. "You poor thing," she cooed. "What terrible things you must have endured." "The bear lady saved me," Thomas said, his voice small but clear. "Papa always says bears are strong and warm, and she kept me warm all night when I was cold." Margaret's expression soured. The cold has confused him, made him imagine things. "I didn't imagine it," Thomas protested, but Margaret shushed him, pressing his face against her shoulder. The crowd began to disperse, taking Thomas with them. Eliza tried to follow, but someone, she couldn't see who in the confusion, threw a stone. It struck her shoulder, sending a sharp pain lancing through her already battered body. "Stay away from decent folk!" Another stone flew, then another. Eliza raised her arms to protect her face as the barrage continued. Small stones, nothing that would seriously injure, but enough to hurt, enough to humiliate. "Please," she begged, backing into her shelter. "Please, just listen." But they wouldn't. The settlement folk she'd lived near for 4 years, whose children she'd smiled at, whose fields she'd helped harvest for pennies, whose sick she'd nursed alongside her mother, they pelted her with stones and words sharper than any rock. When they finally left, Eliza collapsed onto the cold ground of her ruined shelter. Half the walls were gone, burned for fuel. Her bedroll was trampled with muddy footprints. The meager supplies she'd had, a half loaf of bread, some dried berries, a tin cup, were scattered and destroyed. She curled into a ball, too exhausted even to cry. Her body, which had protected Thomas through the worst storm of the season, now had nothing left. No food, no shelter, no warmth, and no hope that anyone would believe her. Jedediah Crane returned to Green River Valley 3 days later, his pack mule laden with furs and venison. He was a man built by the frontier, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of lean, coiled strength that came from years living in the mountains. His face was weathered to leather, his beard shot through with premature gray, though he was barely 30. But his eyes, when they met yours, were surprisingly gentle, the eyes of a man who'd seen too much death to deal it casually. He knew something was wrong the moment he rode into the settlement. Groups of women clustered together, talking in hushed voices that stopped when he passed. Men nodded at him with expressions that were somehow both sympathetic and congratulatory. His heart began to pound. "Where's Thomas?" he asked the first person he could grab, young Billy Henderson, who mucked out stables for the general store. "He's fine, Mr. Crane. He's with the Holloways." Billy's face was flushed with excitement. "But it was a near thing, sir. That Hartwell woman, the big one down by the river, she kidnapped him during the storm." The world seemed to tilt. Jed's hands tightened on Billy's shoulders. What? Grabbed him right before the blizzard hit. Was probably going to hold him for ransom or worse. But Mrs. Holloway and the others found him in her shelter, all confused and cold. They say she barely kept him alive. Jed released the boy and began running toward the Holloway house, his mind racing. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He knew Eliza Hartwell by sight, the heavy girl who lived alone in that miserable shelter. He'd nodded to her a few times, seen her gathering kindling or checking traps. She'd always looked away quickly, as if afraid he'd speak to her. She'd seemed shy, not dangerous. Margaret Holloway answered his frantic knocking with a flour-dusted apron and an expression of practiced sympathy. "Jedediah, thank heavens you're back. Come in, come in. Thomas is napping, but he's well." Jed pushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time to the small bedroom where Thomas slept in a proper bed with actual blankets. His son looked small and pale, but blessedly alive. Jed sank to his knees beside the bed, pressing his forehead against Thomas's small hand. "Papa?" Thomas's eyes opened, still heavy with sleep. "I'm here, son, I'm here." Jed's voice cracked. "Are you hurt?" "No, Papa, the bear lady kept me warm all night. She gave me her coat and her food and her blanket, and she let me sleep on her bed while she stayed by the fire, even though she was cold too." Jed froze. "Bear lady?" "Mm-hmm. She found me when I got lost in the snow. I was so scared, Papa, and so cold. But she dug me out with her hands and carried me and kept telling me I wouldn't die. She ran so far through the snow, and people were watching, but nobody helped her, and she used her whole body like a shield so the wind wouldn't hit me." "Thomas," Jed kept his voice gentle, though his heart was hammering. "Who told you to say this?" Thomas's face scrunched up in confusion. "Nobody told me. I remember it all. Mrs. Holloway says I was confused from being cold, but I wasn't confused, Papa. The bear lady saved my life, just like you saved that man from the river last summer. Mrs. Holloway won't listen, but you'll listen, right?" Jed pulled his son into a fierce hug, his mind racing. A 5-year-old could be confused, could imagine things. But Thomas's memory was specific, detailed, and there was something in his voice, the ring of truth that Jed had learned to recognize in his years negotiating with Indians and trading with trappers. "I'll listen, son. Tell me everything." Thomas's story poured out in the disjointed but earnest way of children. How he'd been playing near the settlement when the snow started falling. How he'd wandered away from Mrs. Cooper, who was supposed to be watching him, chasing what he thought was a rabbit. How the storm had come so fast, and suddenly he was lost and so cold he couldn't feel his hands anymore. "And then the bear lady found me. She was big and warm, Papa, like you said bears are. She dug me out of the snow with her hands. Look, I can still see the scratches on them through the window when Mrs. Holloway bandages them. She gave me her coat even though she didn't have another one. She carried me all the way to her house, and I remember she kept falling down, but she'd get back up every time." "What else, son?" "The people in the town, I saw them, Papa. We passed right by them and she yelled for help, but they just laughed and went inside. Mrs. Holloway was there. I saw her red dress. And when we got to the bear lady's house, she gave me her bed and her blanket and burned her walls in the fire to keep me warm. She didn't sleep all night. I woke up lots of times, and she was always there, keeping the fire going and making sure I was warm." Tears were running down Thomas's small face now. "And then in the morning, those people came and they were mean to her, Papa. They called her bad names and they said she was going to hurt me, but she didn't hurt me at all. She saved me, and they hurt her instead." Jed held his son as the boy cried, his own mind working furiously. If Thomas's story was true, and every instinct Jed had honed in years of survival told him it was, then a grave injustice had been done. He stood, kissing Thomas's forehead. "Stay here and rest, son. Papa needs to go check on something." Margaret Holloway was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her expression unreadable. "He's confused, Jedediah. The cold does strange things to a child's mind." "My son's mind is fine." Jed's voice was flat, dangerous. "Tell me exactly what happened when you found him." Margaret's eyes flickered. "Well, we heard she'd taken him." "Who heard? Who saw?" "Several people. The storm was coming, and we saw her lurking near where Thomas was playing." "You saw her? During the storm?" When it was snowing so hard, a man couldn't see 5 feet in front of his face? Jed took a step closer. Or did you see her after? When she was carrying my son to safety while you all watched from your warm porches? Margaret's face went white, then red. Now see here. No, you see here. Jed's voice was quiet now, more frightening than any shout. I'm going to talk to everyone who was there. And if I find out my son was left to die while folks watched from the comfort of their homes, there's going to be a reckoning. He left her stammering protests and walked out into the snow. Jedediah Crane spent the next 3 hours reconstructing the events of the storm, and with each conversation, his fury grew colder and more certain. Mrs. Cooper, who should have been watching Thomas, admitted through tears that she'd let him wander while she gossiped with friends. But it was only for a moment. The storm came up so fast. Young Billy Henderson, pressed harder, confessed he'd seen Eliza running through the snow with Thomas. I told Ma, but she said to leave it alone, that the Hartwell girl probably caused it somehow. The Simmons boy, who worked odd jobs around the settlement, finally broke under Jed's questioning. I was taking wood from Miss Hartwell's place. Pa sent me, said she wouldn't need it all anyway, and we did. When I went back the next morning after the storm, I could see where she'd had to burn her own walls, but Pa said not to tell anyone. The damning evidence came from Sarah Mitchell, a young mother whose conscience finally overcame her fear of social ostracism. She sought Jed out at the general store, her hands twisting in her apron. Mr. Crane, I need to tell you something. It's been eating at me. She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. I saw the whole thing. I was at my window. We live right at the edge of the settlement. I saw Eliza Hartwell digging Thomas out of that snowdrift with her bare hands. I saw her take off her only coat and wrap him in it, and I saw her try to get help. Tell me. She ran toward the general store where folks had gathered. Mrs. Holloway and the others were standing on the porch. Eliza was screaming for help. I could hear it even through my window. And Mrs. Holloway... Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Mrs. Holloway said something. I couldn't hear what, but everyone laughed, and then they went inside and shut the door. Just shut the door and left her there with your son in the middle of a blizzard. Jed's hands clenched into fists. Why didn't you help? I wanted to. God is my witness, I wanted to, but my husband... She looked away, ashamed. He said if I went out to help her, folks would think poorly of us, that we'd be associated with her. I'm so sorry, Mr. Crane. I should have helped. I'll regret it all my days. By sundown, Jed had the full picture. His son had been rescued by a woman who'd sacrificed everything, her coat, her shelter, her food, her warmth, to keep him alive. The very people who should have helped had instead stolen from her, mocked her, and then accused her of the very crime they'd committed through their inaction. He found Eliza's shelter, or what remained of it, as the sun was setting. The canvas was torn, flapping in the cold wind. 3 of the 4 walls had been burned. The snow around it was trampled with footprints and stained with what looked like blood. Eliza herself was huddled in the corner that still had partial walls on 2 sides, wrapped in a blanket so thin Jed could see through it. She didn't look up when he approached, didn't seem to register his presence at all. Miss Hartwell? She flinched, curling smaller into herself. Miss Hartwell, my name is Jedediah Crane. I'm Thomas's father. Now she looked up, and Jed felt something crack in his chest at the expression in her eyes. Not fear, not hope, but a terrible, hollow resignation. Her face was bruised, her hands bandaged with strips of dirty cloth. I didn't hurt him, she whispered. I swear on my parents' graves, I didn't hurt your son. I know. Jed crouched down to her level, moving slowly so as not to startle her further. Thomas told me what really happened, how you saved his life. Eliza stared at him for a long moment, as if unable to process his words. Then her face crumpled and she began to sob, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed torn from somewhere ancient and wounded. Jed waited, letting her cry. When the storm of tears finally subsided, he spoke again. I need you to come with me into town. No, the word was immediate, panicked. Please no, they'll hurt me again. They won't touch you. I promise you that. Jed's voice was hard as iron. But there are things that need to be said, and you deserve to hear them. I don't want their apologies. Eliza's voice was bitter now, the first flash of anger breaking through her defeated facade. I don't want anything from them. Maybe not, but they owe you a debt, and frontier justice demands it be paid. Jed didn't ask the settlement to gather, he demanded it. He stood in the center of the small square, where farmers brought their goods to trade, Thomas on his shoulders, and called out in a voice that carried across the snow. Every able-bodied person in this settlement has 1 hour to assemble here. Anyone who doesn't come will find themselves unwelcome on any land I hunt or trap. It was no idle threat. Jed's hunting territory covered thousands of acres, including the best routes to the trading posts upriver. To be blacklisted by him was to face economic hardship. Within the hour, nearly every resident had assembled, faces curious and wary. Margaret Holloway stood at the front, her expression haughty. Really, Jedediah, this dramatics is unnecessary. Be quiet. The words were soft but carried unmistakable authority. Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Jed surveyed the crowd, his face expressionless. 3 days ago, during the early blizzard, my son nearly died of exposure. He would have died but for the actions of one person in this settlement. He paused, letting the words sink in. Several people shifted uncomfortably. That person found him buried in snow. She dug him out with her bare hands, hands that are still torn and bleeding from the frozen ground and roots. Jed's voice began to rise. She took off her only warm coat in sub-zero temperatures and wrapped my son in it. She carried him 2 miles through a blizzard while the wind tried to tear them both apart. More uncomfortable shifting. Margaret opened her mouth, but Jed cut her off with a sharp gesture. And during this act of pure courage and selflessness, she passed by the general store where many of you were gathered. His eyes swept the crowd, and people began to look away. She cried out for help, begged for it, and you know what you did? Silence. You laughed. Jed's voice shook now with barely controlled rage. You laughed, and you went inside where it was warm, and you shut the door. You left a woman and a dying child to fight the storm alone. We didn't know, someone called out weakly. You knew, Jed's shout echoed off the buildings. Sarah Mitchell saw it all. Billy Henderson saw it. Half of you saw it. But it was easier to let her struggle alone because she doesn't fit your idea of what's worthy, because she's different. He lifted Thomas from his shoulders and held him so the crowd could see the boy's face. Tell them, son. Tell them who saved you. Thomas's voice was small but clear in the winter air. The bear lady, Miss Eliza. She kept me warm all night and gave me her food and her bed. She stayed up the whole night keeping the fire going so I wouldn't freeze. And when you came, you were mean to her. The child's words hung in the air like an indictment. Jed set Thomas down and continued. But your cruelty didn't stop there. While this woman, Eliza Hartwell, was using the last of her fuel to keep my son alive, some of you were stealing wood from her shelter. He pointed at old man Simons, whose face went purple. You sent your boy to take her firewood. Don't deny it, he confessed. She had extra, Simons started. She had nothing extra. She had to burn her own walls to keep the fire going. And the next morning, when you found them alive because of her, you repaid her by accusing her of kidnapping. Jed's finger moved to Margaret Holloway. You called her a kidnapper in front of a crowd. You spread lies about her intentions. You took my son from her arms without a word of thanks. And then, his voice dropped to something dangerous. Then you stood by while people threw stones at her. Margaret's face had gone white. I didn't throw, but you didn't stop it either, did you? No one spoke. The silence was damning. Jed let it stretch before continuing. Let me be crystal clear about something. Eliza Hartwell saved my son's life at great cost to herself. She is a hero in every sense of the word. And you treated her like a criminal. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat, a list he'd been compiling. Here's what's going to happen. Those of you who took wood from her shelter will replace it tenfold. You'll build her a proper cabin with a stone fireplace. Not a lean-to, a real cabin. It will be completed within 2 weeks. Mutters of protest rippled through the crowd. Those of you who spread false accusations will apologize publicly and in writing. Those letters will be posted in the general store for everyone to see. And, he paused, his eyes finding Margaret, those of you in positions of social authority in this settlement will personally deliver food and supplies to Miss Hartwell every week for the next 6 months. This is ridiculous, someone started. Is it? Jed's voice cracked like a whip. My son was dying. She saved him. You made her life hell for it. This isn't even close to making it right, but it's a start. Anyone who refuses will answer to me personally, and I promise you won't like that conversation." The implied threat was clear. Jed was known as a fair man, but also a dangerous one. No one wanted to cross him. "Where is Miss Hartwell now?" a voice called from the back, Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose conscience had driven her to tell the truth. "She's at my cabin," Jed answered, "under my protection, which means anyone who bothers her, speaks ill of her, or makes her feel unwelcome will also answer to me. Are we understood?" Slowly, reluctantly, heads began to nod. "Good. Now get to work. Miss Hartwell will have a proper home before the next storm comes." The cabin building began the next morning. Jed personally supervised, making sure every log was properly chinked, every corner tight against the wind. He chose a spot on his own property, a small rise with a view of the river and the mountains beyond. Eliza watched from a distance, still not quite believing this was real. She'd spent that first night in Jed's cabin in a real bed, the first real bed she'd slept in since her parents died, and woke expecting it all to have been a dream. But Thomas had crawled in beside her at dawn, chattering happily about Aunt Eliza and how she was going to teach him to make rabbit stew. "You don't have to do this," she told Jed on the third day, when the cabin's frame was taking shape. I know you don't." Jed didn't look up from the log he was notching. "That's one of many reasons you deserve it." They worked in companionable silence for a while before Eliza spoke again. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Now Jed did look up, his weathered face thoughtful. "My son was dead without you. You gave everything you had to save him. If that doesn't earn my respect and protection, then I'm not the man I think I am." He paused. "Besides, Thomas talks about you constantly. You made an impression." As if summoned by his name, Thomas appeared from around the cabin, dragging a small branch. "Miss Eliza, look! I found firewood for your new house." Eliza's throat tightened. She knelt down to his level. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Very thoughtful." Thomas beamed, then threw his small arms around her neck. "I'm glad you're staying with us. Papa gets lonely sometimes. He tries to hide it, but I can tell." Over the boy's head, Eliza's eyes met Jed's. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. They were both lonely people trying to survive in a harsh land. The cabin was completed in 12 days. It was solid and tight, with a stone fireplace that Jed himself had built, a real door with hinges and windows with actual glass, a luxury most frontier cabins lacked. The settlers, shamed by Jed's public calling out, had worked quickly and well. Margaret Holloway delivered the first of the required weekly supplies herself, her expression frozen somewhere between embarrassment and resentment. She set the crate on Eliza's new porch without meeting her eyes. "Mrs. Holloway," Eliza said quietly before she could leave. Margaret turned, wary. "Thank you for taking care of Thomas that day. Whatever else happened, I'm glad he was somewhere warm and safe while his father was away." It was more grace than Margaret deserved, and they both knew it. The older woman's face crumpled slightly. "I should have," she started, then stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not enough, I know, but I'm sorry." Eliza nodded once and Margaret left quickly. "You didn't have to do that," Jed said from where he'd been stacking firewood nearby. "Be kind to her." "She was the first to apologize," Eliza replied. "That takes courage, even if it came late." Jed studied her for a long moment. "You're more forgiving than I'd be." "No," Eliza shook her head. "I'm just tired of being angry. It's exhausting, and I've been tired for so long." Winter deepened, and something unexpected happened. Eliza thrived. With regular meals and a warm, dry place to sleep, her body began to stabilize. The constant stress that had made her cling to every calorie started to ease. She began helping Jed with his hunting and trapping, using skills her father had taught her long ago. She proved surprisingly adept at reading animal signs and setting efficient trap lines. Thomas attached himself to her like a small, cheerful barnacle. She taught him to make cornbread and rabbit stew, to identify animal tracks in the snow, to tell stories by the fire. Jed often found them together in the evenings, the boy curled against her side while she spun tales of brave trappers and magical mountains. "You're good with him," Jed said one night after Thomas had fallen asleep between them by the fire. "Better than I am sometimes." "That's not true. He adores you." He adores us both. Jed's voice was quiet. He's been different since you came. Happier. Eliza carefully lifted Thomas and carried him to his small bed in the loft, tucking him in with practiced care. When she came back down, Jed was still by the fire, staring into the flames. "Can I tell you something?" he asked without looking at her. "Of course." "When Thomas's mother died, I thought about giving him up, bringing him to relatives back east." Jed's jaw tightened. "This place, it's beautiful, but brutal. I wasn't sure I could raise a child here alone, keep him safe and happy and teach him everything he needs to know. Part of me still isn't sure. But you're doing wonderfully, because you're here." Now he did look at her, and Eliza was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "These past weeks, watching you with him, seeing how you care for him, it's shown me what I was missing, what he was missing. A mother's touch, gentleness alongside the hard lessons of frontier life." Eliza's heart began to pound. "Jed, I'm not good with words," he interrupted. "Never have been, but I need to say this." He stood, moving closer to her. "You saved my son's life, and I'll be grateful for that until my dying day. But you've done more than that. You've brought light back to this cabin. You've made it feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between hunts." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know you have no reason to trust men or people or this settlement after what they did to you. But I'd like, if you'd be willing, I'd like you to stay. Not as a hired hand or a guest, but as family." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "As family. As my wife." The words came out rough, almost clumsy, but absolutely sincere. "If you'll have me. If you'll have us." "I'm not," Eliza gestured at herself, all the old insecurities rushing back. "People will talk. They'll say terrible things about you for choosing someone like me." "Let them talk." Jed's grip on her hand tightened. "I've spent 5 years not caring what people think. Not about to start now. The question isn't what they think. It's what you think. Could you be happy here? With us?" Eliza looked around the cabin, the warm fire, the comfortable furniture Jed had made, the small toys scattered in the corner that Thomas played with. She looked up at the loft, where a child she'd saved now slept peacefully, calling her name in his dreams sometimes. She looked at Jed, this rough, kind man who'd stood up for her when no one else would. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I could be happy here. I already am." Jed's weathered face broke into a smile, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Then we'll do this right. Proper ceremony, proper vows. I'll ride to the circuit preacher tomorrow." "Jed." Eliza stopped him, her own smile beginning to bloom. "There's no rush. Let's just be for a while. Get to know each other. Court proper like, the way my parents did." He nodded slowly, still smiling. "Court proper like. I can do that. Fair warning, though. I'm terrible at poetry." Eliza laughed, the sound surprising them both. When had she last laughed? "Lucky for you, I'm not much for poetry myself." The wedding took place in early spring, when the ice broke on the river and the first green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow. It was simple, just Jed and Eliza, Thomas, the preacher, and a handful of guests. Sarah Mitchell came, tears streaming down her face. A few other settlers came too, shamefaced but genuine in their congratulations. Margaret Holloway brought a beautiful quilt as a wedding gift, her own handiwork. "It's not enough," she said quietly to Eliza. "It will never be enough to make up for what I did, but I hope you'll accept it anyway." Eliza took the quilt, running her hands over the careful stitches. "It's beautiful, thank you." Thomas served as ring-bearer, taking his job with utmost seriousness. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the boy piped up, "I object to waiting any longer. I want Miss Eliza to be my mama now." The small gathering laughed, and even the preacher smiled. "Well then, let's not keep the young man waiting." When Jed kissed his new wife, Thomas cheered so loudly that birds scattered from nearby trees. The settlement gradually changed after that. It was slow, change always was, but people began to look at Eliza differently. When she came to town, people nodded respectfully. When she helped birth Sarah Mitchell's second child during a difficult labor, using skills her mother had taught her, The gratitude was genuine. But Eliza's greatest joy was her family. Thomas grew like a weed, learning to hunt and trap alongside his father, learning to cook and garden alongside his mother. He told anyone who would listen about the day the bear lady saved his life, turning it into an epic tale that grew more embellished with each telling. Jed proved to be a devoted husband, steady and kind. On cold nights, they'd lie together by the fire after Thomas slept, and he'd tell her stories of his trapping expeditions, of the wild beauty of the high mountains, of the life they were building together. One evening, nearly a year after that fateful blizzard, Eliza stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Thomas was in the yard, playing with a puppy Jed had traded for. Jed himself was chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe a comforting sound. He caught her watching and set down the axe, crossing to join her. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza leaned into his solid warmth. "About that day in the snow, how certain I was that I'd die alone and unmourned, that my life didn't matter to anyone." Jed wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Your life matters. To me? To Thomas? To this family?" "I know," she smiled up at him. "That's what I was thinking about. How wrong I was. How one act of doing what was right, what anyone should have done, changed everything." "You did more than what was right." Jed's voice was soft but fierce. "You gave everything you had to save my son. That's not ordinary kindness, Eliza. That's heroism." Thomas looked up from his puppy and shouted, "Mama, Papa, come see. He learned a new trick." They went, hand in hand, to admire the puppy's trick, which mostly involved jumping on the boy and licking his face. But as they walked, Eliza remembered something Jed had whispered to her that first night she'd stayed in his cabin, when she was still scared and hurting and certain nothing good could come of any of this. "You saved my son," he'd said. "That means you're family now, and I protect family." It had seemed impossible then. But standing here now, watching Thomas play while the mountains turned purple in the sunset, Eliza understood the power of that whisper. Words spoken in kindness and meant with absolute sincerity. Words that promised safety, belonging, and home. The mountain man's whisper had indeed changed her life forever, but not in the way the cruel people of the settlement had feared. It had changed her life by giving her back what she thought she'd lost forever: worth, purpose, and love. And that, Eliza thought as she squeezed Jed's hand and called to Thomas that supper would be ready soon, was the best revenge possible. Not punishment for those who'd wronged her, but a life so full of joy they could see what they'd almost destroyed.